Hi everyone and welcome back. So here we are covering microservices. In the last couple of videos we did CI/CD with the AWS EC2, like deploying the Node.js microservice to the AWS. Now we are going to deep dive into a totally different world, which is AWS serverless and AWS server-based world. So this is what we are thinking. So we already have a Node.js microservice here, which we already built, and obviously the Node.js microservice has a dependencies, and this is the whole package we need to bundle when we are deploying this to the Lambda. Now we need to understand few things before we even start further. So let's say this is the boundary we are putting. So here we are covering your code and CI/CD. This is all about what do you call is your code and CI/CD, because it doesn't involve your infrastructure. And we are going to use AWS CDK or serverless or the cloud formation to spin up our infrastructure. Okay. Now, if we talk about serverless, so these are like three different platform you can say to spin up your infrastructure using code or configuration. It's called as infrastructure as a code, because you are not going to AWS console and saying, okay, create a EC2 instance or something like that. What you are going to do is you are going to build that infrastructure using your code and your configuration. So this is my AWS account and we are going to ping pong on lots of different things. We will talk about Lambda, Elastic Beanstalk. I mean, there are different platforms on which you can deploy your Node.js service, because it's all about microservice, and this comes AWS. Okay, on AWS, what all we are talking? First, we'll talk about serverless. Obviously not, because I already have covered a serverless here. So let's say you wanted to explore serverless and how it really works with AWS, and how this serverless framework is helping you to deploy your service as a Lambda function. Then you can just take a look onto this. This covers everything about, okay, how to create a basic Node.js microservice and deploy that as a Lambda using serverless framework, which is nothing but this. So what you are doing, these are the three different options we are exploring: serverless, CloudFormation, and AWS CDK. This is serverless, where you are writing a simple deployment configuration, something like this: function create user, your runtime Node.js 14, 16, 18. This is the event. You attach API gateway, and then when you do serverless deploy, a single command, obviously you need to configure your AWS credentials, and then when you do serverless deploy, what it will do, it will deploy your function which you have written as a Lambda, and will also attach an API gateway to that. And then obviously the plugins, add-ons, you can actually track your service, all those things. So that's a serverless. You can explore the documentation. Serverless is it has a serverless YML where you are actually defining, okay, and it's a vendor independent. That means you can use serverless framework to deploy your Lambda on AWS, on Azure, on GCP, and all the other platform. What you are specifying is you are just specifying in serverless YML, okay, what is your provider. I think we are specifying provider somewhere, like provider name AWS, region, profile. Similarly, there should be something for GCP or Azure. So in your code, let's say I wrote a Node.js microservice. What else I will be needing? You need a serverless YML, serverless setup. That's it. In serverless YML, you will specify, okay, which one is your Lambda function file, what all things you wanted to create, and the serverless.yml will create an infrastructure for you, because that is what we are doing here. Let's say I'm deploying my service as a Lambda. So what all things I need? I need a Lambda function created and deployed on AWS. I need an API gateway if I want to build a REST API, and if I need a database, then Dynamodb or RDS. Because what we are doing is we are using this code as a infrastructure, and we are deploying our microservice as a function as a service, FAS. Okay, so to build this whole thing, we want a Lambda, we want API gateway and some database. Either you can use this serverless framework to spin up everything for you, and what you need is you just need a AWS credentials setup, and you do serverless deploy, it will look into your serverless.yml. It will deploy things for you. Okay, so there is already, I have created a good resource on this, how to work with the serverless framework when you want to deploy your Node.js service. Okay, now here comes AWS CDK, how it is different from serverless. In AWS CDK, from CDK Cloud Development Kit, that means AWS is providing the utility classes and TypeScript code. So because AWS CDK, in this thing, you can write your code in Python, Node.js, and you can write the whole infrastructure using your native programming language. Okay, this is CDK. So what actually we are doing when it comes to CDK, we are actually writing a JavaScript code, TypeScript code, Python code, or Java code. And how the code looks like, I can just talk a simple example. Let's say TypeScript workshop, and this is my project structure, and this is simple code you are writing. So what this code looks like, this code for me is a TypeScript code, and what I'm doing is, with the help of this TypeScript code, I'm able to create SQS. Can be Lambda, can be SNS topic, can be API gateway, can be Dynamodb. These resources you can create by writing just a simple plain TypeScript code, which you also understand. Okay, I'm using this abstraction provided by AWS CDK, where I can use SQS, SNS, Lambda. I can create anything. The only important thing is, I'm not dealing with the YML configurations and some complex structures. I'm dealing with just a TypeScript code, which will be sitting with your microservice code in just another folder. Okay, so that is what we are talking here. Okay, now AWS CDK. That is, AWS CDK is nothing but a way in which you can build the AWS components. You can create the AWS component on the cloud. Either what I will do is, let's say I don't know AWS CDK or serverless and all, then what I will do is I will go to Lambda and I will say create my Lambda first. Okay, create function. I will just say, okay, my first Lambda, or just let's say auth API service, Node.js 20, execution role, all these things you will specify, and then you just do a create function. That is manual thing. What if my Lambda function need an interaction with the Dynamo? Okay, then I will go to Dynamodb, and then I will create a Dynamo table there. If you need an API gateway, then you will go to here, you can create a table. Okay, you specify the table name, partition key, index key, and all. If you need an API gateway, because Lambda can be invoked either through API gateway or through some external events, like, okay, you are uploading a file on S3 and you wanted to invoke a Lambda. So there is a Lambda trigger that can be invoked through SQS, SNS, API gateway, or through different mediums, or Dynamo stream and all. Here we can create an API gateway, because Lambda can be invoked through the API gateway. So here there are three different options. Okay, I can build a REST API private, HTTP API, okay, WebSocket. So these are different interface. I mean, HTTP API or REST API kind of a similar. WebSocket is different. Like if you want a WebSocket to your service, then you can build it something like this. You can import a Swagger definition, and it will just create a whole structure for you. Okay, so that's all about all these things, but we are not going to touch the console. If you really want to understand all those things in depth, I will suggest you go through this serverless playlist. There I also have covered, okay, what is Lambda, what is API gateway, what is serverless, all those things. But here we are just going to consume these components. So we are not only talking about serverless. Now here is the different platform where I'm targeting to deploy things. Okay, let's put first serverless. Okay, I will just change the color, and this is first is serverless. Then second we can talk, because we already discussed about the AWS virtual machines, EC2 instance. There we were deploying the application. Then we can talk about AWS ECS. Let me make it a little large. This is serverless. I mean, serverless means AWS component, like, okay, I need a Lambda, API gateway, all those things. So we do have only our Node.js microservice. I wrote something in AWS CDK, that will help me to create serverless framework. I mean, not serverless framework, serverless stuff. Okay, I can create a Lambda, I can create API gateway, I can create a Dynamodb table. All those things I can create using AWS CDK. Okay. Next thing is, let's say I'm not using serverless stuff. What I'm thinking is I just wanted to deploy things on container, because till now we talked about three things: deploying your microservice on virtual machine VM, and these VMs can be AWS EC2 instance. But now, I mean, we are talking about these things in 2024. So there are container based solution also available. I mean, you already know, have played with Docker locally. So there are solutions like AWS ECS, or if you talk about containerized managed solution, then we talk about Kubernetes, KTS, right? For now, we'll talk about AWS ECS, and virtual machines we have already talked about. And then third platform where we can deploy is the Lambda, AWS Lambda. Okay. I mean, Lambda is not something which is available on AWS. There are these functions like Azure functions, Google Cloud functions. This concept is available everywhere. Similarly, the container-based solutions, apart from Kubernetes, AWS ECS, similarly, Google Cloud also has something, containerized solution. Similarly, Azure might also have something. So what it is giving you? It is giving you the container-based solutions where your application can stay inside container and can run. So there are some tiny containers where your applications can stay and can scale. And when it comes to having your microservice spinning across different pods, I mean, in Kubernetes language, the container is called pod. Then there comes a Kubernetes, because then you need to manage everything about the pod, which pod is dying, and how load balancing between different pods, managing the whole containerized solution. In that case, you need a Kubernetes, or you can use the native solution ECS. ECS is also container based solution. Here in ECS we are creating container on top of virtual machines like EC2 or Fargate. Or I don't want to deal with the Kubernetes or ECS. I just have my AWS microservice. I want to deploy that as a Lambda. That is not running 24/7. I want to do some cost savings. I don't have many microservice. I will just deploy my service as a Lambda. That will be bootstrapped when there is a request. Otherwise, it will be like sleeping always, and I will not be paying for that. So it's like event-driven Lambda. Whenever there is an event coming from the client, from the HTTP APIs, then only I will make a request. So these are the three different segments we are going to touch: deploying your service, deploying your function as a Lambda, deploying your function on the ECS, deploying your service on AWS EC2, right? These are the three different options. This we have explored using GitLab and GitHub Actions. This we are talking about, and this itself is not a small thing. This is known as a serverless. It's like a big chunk, and that's known as a AWS serverless. Because everything is serverless here. We are doing Lambda function, API gateway, Dynamo, and we are not using, the servers to deploy our application. We are using AWS serverless technology. Serverless is just a set of stuff like, okay, gateway, DynamoDB, Lambda, Dynamo, or all these things combined, considered inside a serverless, where you just deploy your application as a Lambda, as a function, and then you hit those through the API gateway. So the architecture is something like this. This is your API gateway. Okay, API gateway can invoke Lambda, and your whole microservice will be residing under one single Lambda. It was not possible earlier, 4 or 5 years. Earlier, we used to create a single HTTP method like this. Okay, I want to create a resource, something like, okay, users, API users get. I remember those things. I used to create a single Lambda for it. And name can be api.users.get, something like this. And if I want to create a new resource, then I was creating another Lambda for this. API users.post. Something like this, right? Now, I don't like this approach. I will be deploying the whole microservice as a single Lambda, and then I will be just doing a proxy to this Lambda, and this Lambda already has an internal routing that will take care of all the endpoints internally. And then this is your Dynamo or RDS or anything where you want to get the data from. In serverless world, we use Dynamo, which is AWS managed. You don't need to do much. You just create a table and then do the data. It's already scaling enough. So our target is this AWS Lambda. And we are not going to, if you want to create a Lambda function, you can go and manually create a Lambda function, and then you zip your code, you zip your Node.js microservice inside a zip folder and upload it. You just need to specify which one is your handler and which one is your root function which you want to invoke. And all those things are happening through CDK. We are not going to touch. Now, the important part in this whole journey, yes, we will talk about ECS, Lambda, and if you want to, I will just give you the manual guideline. Okay, if you want to deploy your application using Elastic Beanstalk, that also we can do, because that is also server based, and it is, these two solutions are server based. So I will just change their color to, let's say, yellow, and this is container based. This is also server based. This is also yellow. This I will just make it as a dark green, because this is Lambda serverless. Okay. So first of all, in this whole journey, we already know how we are building a microservice. We have the code. It can be simple Express app, having simple endpoint get, put, post, delete on the user or some user CRUD operation. Then we are going to build an infra for that, because it's a REST API. We need API gateway. We need a Lambda. And if you want some kind of a CRUD operation, then for data storage, we need a Dynamodb. So all those things we are going to spin up through the AWS CDK. And then all these things will process through same pipeline. Here we are going to build a CI/CD that will just execute command something like this: npx deploy stack name. And obviously we need, our CI/CD needs to have access to AWS credentials so that they can create resources on AWS platform. That those resources are Lambda, API gateway, Dynamodb and all. Then we will also talk about container based solution. Let's say I know how to deploy an EC2. I know how to deploy my app as a Lambda. How can I do on the container based solution? Because these are containers. And when it comes to container, the first thing which came into our mind is we need to create an image to deploy them as on a container. So we already have a Node.js app. What we will do is we will build an image for the Docker image for the Node.js, and we will push that Docker image on the ECR registry. I mean, that is AWS managed ECR, like Docker Hub registry, right? From there we can get the image. So what we do is our CI/CD will do nothing. CI/CD will have one task, is to deploy your application and push the image to the ECR registry. Okay. Then the rest of the task is, okay, pull the latest version from the ECR, because I have an access, and we also need to provide an access to our CI/CD stuff to push your build image of your Node.js app into ECR, and from ECR we will pull the latest image and we'll deploy it, like creating a container out of image. So your whole Node.js app will be bundled as a Docker image. Then you build and create a Docker image, and then while deploying, it means only we need to create a container from the deployed build image. If you know the Docker, then you might understand. What do you have? You have just an image. You do build, and when you just run the image, it creates a container, the live container, which can expose the HTTP interface, and it will expose a microservice for you. Okay. So that's our plan. So first, we will look into how AWS CDK work. If you are interested on serverless, there is a playlist already. Play with that. If you have any questions, I can take another session. AWS CDK is something which we are going to work on. If you are interested and you want to learn ahead, then you can just go into this AWS CDK workshop. You just need to install the CDK globally, and then you can start using these commands. It will create a sample TypeScript project for you. And here you can just create a different stack. Here we are going to create a serverless stack that contains a Lambda, API gateway, and Dynamo if needed. We will deploy that stack. It will create resources. Under the hood, AWS CDK uses CloudFormation. That's the important point that we will talk also. It uses a CloudFormation only. It creates a CloudFormation template and the configurations. But as a developer, if I'm writing a code, I don't need to worry about configurations and YML files. What I need to worry about is writing the TypeScript code, because I'm already doing a TypeScript work here, right? I'm already doing a TypeScript stuff here, and I'm fine writing some more code for my infrastructure, which creates, this is a Lambda based microservice. I want to create a Lambda, Lambda function. I need an API gateway to hit that Lambda API gateway. That's it. Then if you want to use more AWS component, you can create S3, SNS, SQS, anything you can create through CDK. That's a TypeScript code you are writing. Okay. So let's dive in and let's understand more on AWS CDK. But this is the overall picture which we are targeting, and we will go one by one.